Great, it's great to see all of you today. Welcome and thank you for coming out. I'm Freya Sonnenstein. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Baldwin County. If you don't know anything about our organization, we were established in 1990. And we are now over 100 years old, and we've actually been active in Baldwin County since the very beginning. And we have a trophy with a date of 1924 on it for registering most voters in Baldwin County. We are nonpartisan. And we are now composed of both men and women, and we're working to protect and expand voting rights and to ensure that everyone is represented in our democracy. We do this through voter registration, advocacy, education, and litigation when we need to. If you would like to know more about us better, or better still, if you would like to join us, we've got all kinds of information on the back table over there. So please stop by and look at it. And we also have lots of information about the coming election, including voter registration applications and sample ballots. They're pretty hard to read. Take a look at them. They're this big and the type is small. And all you need to make sure that you've checked your voter registration status, because you need to do that so that when you get to the polls, they'll have your name on the list. And if you don't know how to do that, we'll show you how to do it. So go to the back again. We've got a lot of people to thank for putting together this great evening for us. First, the Fairhope Public Library, especially Tamara Dean and Trista Lackey. They're co-sponsoring this event and they're providing the venue, as you can see. I'd also like to give special thanks to some of our members. Everybody's been involved, but especially to Drinker Hastings, Ruth Rutkowski, and Vivian McMurray for their help with organizing this event. And also we'd like to shout out and thank you to the Sierra Club, who first introduced us to Dr. McClintock's work. Now, protecting the beautiful and fragile environment that we are so privileged to inhabit has been a long-standing concern of the Baldwin County League of Women Voters. And as Hurricane Milton barrels towards Tampa, our hearts go out for our neighbors over there as they experience another massive onslaught that can partially be attributed to climate change. Tonight, we are privileged to have a speaker who's made studying one aspect of this phenomenon a life's work. Dr. McClintock is an endowed university professor of polar and marine biology at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. His award-winning research on Antarctic marine ecology has contributed greatly to scientists and the public's understanding of the implications of Antarctic ice melt. He is the author of hundreds of scientific articles and 2 books, and one of them will be available here after the presentation. Dr. McClintock is a master at explaining and translating this complex research findings for audiences such as ours. And so let me welcome Dr. McClintock to our podium to explain to us why we should care about what is happening in that area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thanks to everybody coming tonight. 31 trips to Antarctica. Wow. And I'm still there. Lovely life. So, let me begin by telling you a little bit about where I spent the last couple of years. This is the Palmer Station area on the western Antarctic Peninsula. And when I arrived here 20 years ago, I didn't realize that I was moving to a region of the planet that is warming so rapidly. I really wasn't focused on it. But by living there, I experienced what's happening. And I want to share that story with you, what I witnessed. So Antarctica is warming. And you may know Antarctica as a continent, the size of India and China combined. And when scientists looked at the temperature data from satellites and on the ground, they saw that the western side of Antarctica and the Antarctic Peninsula, that 800-mile length peninsula, are warming. We also know now that the ice shelves surrounding Antarctica are melting, both on the west and the east. What's an ice shelf? An ice shelf is 1,000-foot thick ice that's connected to the land. And we know that these are beginning to melt. Why are they melting? Because the largest current on the planet, the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, is beginning to warm. It goes around Antarctica in a clockwise direction. Well, how much warming are we talking about? We're really lucky at Palmer Station because 30 miles down the coast, there's a Ukrainian station. And they've been measuring air temperatures for over 60 years daily. And if you look at those midwinter air temperatures and you plot them, over that period of time, there's been about a 10-degree Fahrenheit increase in the temperature, the air temperature. That's rapid warming. That's what we're seeing happen in the Arctic and here on the Antarctic Peninsula. So what does that mean? I can tell you that when I first arrived at the station 20 years ago, I would sit at my computer to be working, and I would hear a crash sound. I'd leap up and run down the hall with my colleagues, and we'd throw open the door, and we'd watch big waves coming down the bay because our neighbor in the backyard, the Mar Glacier, had dropped a chunk of ice in there the size of a house. This was a big deal. People got excited. It was fun to watch. When I was in Palmer Station 2 years ago, my last trip, most recent trip, this was happening 3 or 4 times a day. 87% of the glaciers along the 800-mile length of the Western Peninsula are now receding. And you can see it. You can measure it. You can take pictures of it. You can see where the glacier was in 1975 in the yellow line, when my colleagues told me that you could open the back door of Palmer Station and almost step onto the glacier, and now you have to hike about half a kilometer to get to the edge. We also know from wonderful measurements that satellites can make that glacial thinning is occurring, melt of glaciers. And notice again that it's primarily on the western side of Antarctica where you're seeing the glacial melt. And then look at Greenland in the northern hemisphere, another very, very significant place where glaciers are melting. Now, this was a surprise. Scientists had no idea that the Thwaites Glacier over on the western side of Antarctica was melting at such a rapid rate. 14 kilometers to retreat between 1992 and 2011. 14 kilometers. What is going on? Well, it turns out that the ocean goes under this glacier and the warmth of the warming waters accelerated the melt. Why do they care? Why is it a big deal? Because the Thwaites Glacier is a figurative cork. It is the point at which the western ice sheet moves and empties into the ocean. With the absence of the Thwaites Glacier, that movement will be more rapid, and that will affect sea level rise. So that's the big concern. That's why it's being studied by many big groups. What about ice shelves around where we've been working on the Western Peninsula? So they've been breaking out. Part of that is normal, but it's been accelerating. And I'll show you a couple examples. The Larsen B ice shelf over on the eastern side of the peninsula. Here's an image taken by a satellite on January 31st in 2002. Look at the striations in the ice. And here we are a month later, the Larsen B ice shelf was breaking up. And 2 weeks later, it went out to sea. So this is a piece of ice the size of Rhode Island, 1,000-foot deep ice. More recently, you might have seen this back in 2017 in the news, the Larsen C ice shelf breakout. And this is a big crack that formed. So the Larsen B was the earlier one. Here's another one in the Larsen C. They followed the crack. Eventually, it floated free. We had the world's largest iceberg. The iceberg was the size of Delaware. Imagine that. So the good news, there is some good news. These pieces of ice, when they melt, do not contribute to sea level rise. These ice shelves, because they're already in the water, do not contribute to sea level rise. Think about a glass of ice water. When the ice melts, the water doesn't come out at the top of the glass. It's the same physics, okay? They've already displaced things, so they don't contribute to sea level rise. But what does concern scientists is that in the absence of these ice shelves, the movement of the ice sheet behind them is accelerated. So they kind of act like barriers. They're blocking the movement of that ice sheet. And when you move ice from land into the water, that does contribute to sea level rise. So the movement of the ice sheets into the oceans of Antarctica will be part of the calculation as how much sea level rise we're all going to experience. All right, so that's a little bit about the ice. Let's talk about life. I'm a marine ecologist. I study life. And what a lucky career to work in Antarctica where life is so abundant. Probably the most poignant story I can tell you is the story of the Adelie penguin. Now, my colleague in the back of this National Geographic photo, Bill Frazier, arrived at Conversation as a lowly graduate student, and he tagged 16,000 breeding pairs of Adelie penguins for his doctoral project. Can you imagine? Now that is a doctoral project. And Bill came back every year. He came back every year for 45 years. And he followed that population of penguins out in front of the station on these little islands near us. He has one of the most comprehensive data sets for penguin populations anywhere in the world. And this is what's happened. Unfortunately, Bill's penguins are in the purple line. And you can see back in 1974 when he tagged 16,000 breeding pairs. And he told me most recent data in 2023 that there were 1,000 now. So 90% of those penguins have disappeared from that population. And because they have tags on them, we know they're not moving to another location. They're actually not doing well, they're disappearing. Now, at the same time, the chin strap penguin in the top right picture, one of my favorites, I love the little chin strap. The chin strap penguin appeared in the 1970s. There's now a small population of 300 or 400 breeding pairs of chin straps around common. And the Gentoo penguin in the middle picture has absolutely exploded. They are moving in. There are 3,000 or 4,000 breeding pairs of Gentoo penguins. What is going on? These penguins, the Gentoo and the chin strap, really shouldn't be here. Historically, they haven't. The reason they're moving in is because they're extending their range as it's getting warmer. So we have movement of penguins because of this. So what's happening to Adelie penguins? If Bill was here right now, he'd tell you a couple of things. First, he'd tell you that ironically, as the air is getting warmer, it's more humid. And with more humidity, it's snowing more and later than it used to. So you can have the penguins that are genetically programmed to lay their eggs at a certain time, show up, lay their eggs, and then a snowstorm shows up and buries the eggs. And sadly, when that ice melts, snow melts, the eggs don't survive. So you can lose a generation of penguins, and these storms have become more frequent. The other thing that's happening is the Antarctic sea ice is disappearing. Now, I have not mentioned sea ice. Sea ice is about 5 foot thick ice. In the winter, sea ice doubles the size of the continent of Antarctica. And in the summer, it melts and goes away. It's kind of like a clock, it ticks. So many species in Antarctica have become adapted to the sea ice. We call them sea ice dependent species. And the Adelie penguin is one of them. The Adelie uses the sea ice as a platform. And they toboggan across the ice out to the ice edge where they catch krill. They're little shrimp-like animals. They're the sort of the quintessential base of the food webs of Antarctica. And now what's happening is with the sea ice being depleted, the penguins have to swim much further offshore to get to their food resources. And Bill thinks they're on such a tight energy budget raising their chicks, that's hurting the population. Now, we also know that in the absence of sea ice, we could have trouble with krill. Now, we just discovered within the last 20 years that when krill are teenagers, they live under the sea ice feeding on little plant cells called diatoms. So this sea ice is important to their ecology. If you have a depletion in krill, then anything that feeds on krill could be impacted. And what comes to mind immediately, probably with all of you, are the beautiful baleen whales that are so common in Antarctica. Now, I'm not going to share any bad news with whales in Antarctica because there is none at the moment. The whale populations of Antarctica have been exploding. In fact, on an afternoon on a cruise ship, a research ship, I should say, I counted 57 humpback whales just in an afternoon. The reason the whale biologists are so excited is they think what's happened is because we hunted whales so close to extinction, they have finally rejuvenated their populations back to the numbers that they needed to begin to really take off. So whales are doing well. So far, the krill issue is not a problem. What about my favorite seal, the whale seal? What a beautiful seal. They have the most amazing adaptation. The female, only the female, has ice-chewing teeth. And when she's pregnant, she swims up under the sea ice and she looks up to find a hole, usually just a little hole, and she takes her teeth and starts to chew at the ice. And eventually, after a period of time, she's chewed a hole that's big enough that she can climb right through the hole and lay next to it and give birth. Her pups are separated from the ice edge, where the killer whales and the leopard seals are prowling. So all because of her dentition, she has a refuge for her children. It's really quite remarkable. Now, with the sea ice retreating, she may follow the sea ice. She is sea ice dependent, or perhaps they'll go to shore. We don't really know. And we don't know what's going to happen to the leopard seal either. Leopard seals are top predators, 10 feet long, 1,200 pounds. When we're diving and we see a leopard seal, we get out of the water. In fact, we have a little siren that we drop into the water and set off, because if the divers are down and the seal comes, we want the divers to know. And the divers hear the siren immediately, come together back to back, and they're watching the seal go by a little closer each time. But eventually it kind of darts off for a little bit, and that's the cue to come up. So they come up very quickly, and haul them into the boat and move to another place. We don't want to test the hypothesis that there's going to be a problem. But these are beautiful animals, beautiful seals. They really are. They've never been seen giving birth anywhere but on an ice floe, on the sea ice. So the question is, if the sea ice is going to disappear, where are they going to go? They may very well go to shore and give birth on land, but nobody's seen that yet. What about the tiny things in the ocean, the plankton, the little plant cells we call phytoplankton, or the little animals that eat them called zooplankton? How amazingly great was it that the National Science Foundation established a program that samples the plankton of the Antarctic Peninsula every year. And they've had this for 30 years. And the gentleman in the middle with the white cap, Hugh Ducklow, professor at Columbia, directed the program. I said to Hugh, can you take 30 years of data and put it into one slide for me? And he actually did. I was impressed. So this is the slide that he sent me, and what he's doing is the two cartoons on the top are the tip of the peninsula, and the two cartoons on the bottom are further down the peninsula. And what's happening is you're comparing the 70s and 80s with the 90s and 2000s. So what's happening in the big picture is we're moving from a cold, dry, polar environment to a warm, humid, sub-Antarctic environment. And this is causing changes in the weather. It's much windier than it used to be. And with the wind, the ocean surface is getting churned up. And some of the phytoplankton are getting pushed deeper by the churning. And that means that the zooplankton are having trouble finding enough to eat, because those phytoplankton don't survive without sunlight. So we are seeing some effects on the amount of krill in this area. Further down the peninsula, nothing's happening yet, but Dr. Ducklow thinks eventually we'll see the same pattern. So there is an impact on the plankton. Now, what other things might happen with storms? You may not know this. There are forests in Antarctica. All you have to do to see a forest in Antarctica is put your dry suit on with me, throw your tanks on your back. We'll slip into the water together at the dock. It's only 2 degrees, and you will be swimming amongst 150 species of seaweeds. Some of the big brown seaweeds are so big that they extend to the top of this roof with blades 10 feet long. Along the western Antarctic Peninsula, there's enough sunlight to support these forests. Now, I think in a warming world, the forests are going to do very well. They're probably going to grow deeper than they used to. They may grow further down the coastline because they're not blocking of the sunlight. But we also know from our work at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, the UAB, that some of these algae, many of these seaweeds, have chemicals in them that defend them from predators. And we don't know what's going to happen when there's more light, more energy. Could it affect the chemistry that they produce, and who eats them? We don't know. What about the offspring of things like sponges and soft corals and starfish and sea urchins? We call them larvae. You're looking at a baby starfish. This little Antarctic baby will spend 4 months developing before it becomes a little starfish, just like a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. 4 months. That's very slow in the world development for larvae. Guess what? If you collect these in the field from the ocean, and you bring them in the lab and you raise the temperature just 2 degrees, they develop in 4 or 5 weeks instead of 4 months. So what's going on? They haven't experienced warming. So it's like their enzymes go a little crazy and they develop very quickly. Now, if that was to happen, maybe it's a good thing. It means they're in the water less time to be eaten by predators. But many of these larvae have a feeding phase where they feed on phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton in Antarctica tend to occur in blooms. What if they show up at the cafeteria and the door's still locked? In other words, they're not in sync with the bloom of plankton. That's something that we have to think about. Now, I already told you that there were 2 species that are showing up where they hadn't been before. Remember the chinstrap and the Genfu penguin are moving down, extending their range? Well, elephant seals in the top picture arrived some time ago, but they continued to move in. On a warm afternoon, our station, if there's 5 or 6 laying around outside the door, it can be very odoriferous. Fur seals, the lower picture, have also arrived. Now, unlike the elephant seals, they haven't started having pups, they haven't established a colony, but eventually we think they probably will. And again, these are extensions of species that are typically in less cold areas moving into areas that are warming, even warmer. All right, so we have range extensions. Perhaps the most poignant range extension, and some folks have used the word invasion, which is probably a little too dramatic. I'll set the stage with here. You're looking at the Antarctic shelf community. So this is down about 800 meters, surrounds Antarctica. It's a very rich, diverse group of organisms. It developed essentially when Antarctica separated from South America about 40 million years ago. And then about 20 million years ago, as Antarctica moved towards its final position, the Antarctic circumpolar current was established. That locked Antarctica into a deep freeze, and some species were not able to survive, others adapted. So these are all the ones that survived. There are some conspicuous absences. No sharks. Not a single shark in Antarctica. There are no fish with crushing jaws. Every species, every individual species of the total of 250 fish species is a wimp. They feed on little crustaceans. They have a little mouth. Nothing like a parrotfish. Have you ever snorkeled in the Caribbean and listened to a parrotfish eat coral? Nothing with a crushing jaw. And there's nothing in Antarctica with a claw. There's no crabs. There's no lobsters. So this ecosystem, this community of organisms, which includes a lot of shell invertebrates, clams, mussels, snails, is very weakly calcified. So if I was to hand my wife Fern an Antarctic clam, she could take 2 fingers and crush the shell. They're very thin. And this may very well because they never had to invest in protecting themselves from crushing predators. There are none. So you can imagine the surprise of my colleague, Sven Thatchy, who on January 25th, 2007, was the first scientist to witness king crabs on the Antarctic slope. 13 of them. He was flying a submarine from a ship above when he came across them. So why did this make the news? Because crabs have lived around Antarctica in the deep sea for a very long time. No surprise. But as you go up the Antarctic slope, the temperature actually drops. It gets colder. Crabs do not do cold. If you put crabs in cold, they act like they're drunk. They fall over. They miss their mouth when they try to feed themselves. They cannot regulate magnesium in their body fluids, and that makes sort of a narcotic effect. So here we have a situation where what may be happening is that as the deep waters begin to warm, the physiological curtain is beginning to open. Now, to study this, I put a grant proposal together with Dr. Rich Aronson in Florida, and we sent it to the NSF, the National Science Foundation. And while it was being considered for funding, another group of scientists came across 1.5 million king crabs living in a very deep canyon within sight of conversation. Now, it was down even deeper than the slope. So they weren't up on the slope, they were poised. So we essentially, So we essentially followed this up with studies of our own. And we took a ship that we had got funded by NSF, and we towed a submarine up the Antarctic slope and onto the shelf in 10-kilometer transects with cameras on the submarine taking pictures of the bottom every 10 seconds. We did this at 10 different sites along the Antarctic Peninsula over a period of 3 different cruises. We amassed hundreds of thousands of images of the seafloor to establish whether the crabs were on the slope or if they had reached the shelf and what they were doing to the seafloor. When you have a massive database with that much information, as a scientist, you use a very important instrument or tool called the graduate student. We had our graduate students analyze all this data, and basically the bottom line is the crabs are on the slope. Definitely, but they have not reached the shelf. They're still several hundred meters below the shelf, so that's good news for now. Now, I want to also tell you a little bit about an area of research that we've been doing. This is sort of the stepchild to temperature climate warming. This is called ocean acidification. And all marine biologists are very concerned about this because what's happening is as we release carbon dioxide from combusting fossil fuels, 30% of the CO2 ends up in the oceans. And that causes a chemical reaction that essentially makes it more difficult to make shell and to sustain your shell. Now, Antarctica is the canary in the coal mine because the colder the seawater, the more CO2 is absorbed. It's a basic physics kind of principle. So the Antarctic Ocean is the most potentially impacted ocean. So we have done some work there. We were funded by NSF to do some work. And what we essentially found is that there are winners and there are losers. Some species seem to be quite capable of withstanding future conditions of ocean acidification, and others are having trouble or will have trouble. Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the sea butterfly because this beautiful little animal the size of the tip of a pencil, and as common as the stars in the sky, and is part of the global carbon cycles, is already being impacted in some areas of the Southern Ocean, where you can put them under a microscope and you can see that the aragonite forms of shells beginning to erode a little bit, dissolve from ocean acidification. So it's happening now. So this is the research that we have been doing with shell invertebrates, and we had two graduate students, Kate Schoenrock and Julie Schramm, who had done this work down there and did lots of neat papers and publications from it. So this is a list of what I've just gone over with you. The glacial recession, the coastal ice sheets breaking up, decreased extension of pack ice, declines in the delis and other penguins are being influenced in their range extensions, elephant seals, temperature and warmth, all this stuff. I mean, it's a long list. It's a long list. We're going from a community that looked like this before climate warming, where we had regular annual predictable sea ice, the Adelie penguin populations, krill. We had the nice macroalgal forests and the benthic invertebrates, and this community was fed by the APC, the Antarctic Circuit Polar Current. So this is sort of what it's looked like for millennia. And this is where we're headed. Probably by mid-century, certainly by end of century, the sea ice along the western Antarctic Peninsula will be gone. The Adelie with it. The Gentoo and the chinstrap penguins will have moved in because they don't need sea ice. They're not sea ice dependent. The forests on the seafloor may have extended their size. We might have king crabs, we don't know. And again, this is all being fed by the ACC. So it's a very different community. It's changing. That's the deal. That's the deal. And you're saying to yourself, but communities always change. They always change. Well, that's true. They do. Biological communities do change. But what's so different right now is the rate of change. It's happening so fast. Some of these species just can't make it quick enough to adapt to these changes. So, why should we care about what's happening in Antarctica? If you were to leave this room right now and go to Antarctica, it would take you at least a week or more to get there. Right? It's out of sight, out of mind. So what I like to share with the audience is something that's very practical. Part of our own research at LWV is involved in chemical ecology, the study of chemicals that are defending things from being eaten. Those toxic chemicals could be agents to fight cancer and AIDS and cystic fibrosis and different human diseases. So for the past 3 decades, we've had a drug discovery program aligned with our own ecology work. We found some interesting things. We found that there is a tunicate, the little blobby organism, orange, kind of grows on the seafloor, looks a little bit like a sponge. This little animal called Synoium has a chemical in it that we named pomerolide. If you discover a new chemical, you get to name it. You're not allowed to name it after yourself, though. So we named it after the station pomerolide. Pomerolide was sent off to the National Cancer Institute and screened against 20 different types of human cancer cell lines. And the NCI called us up and said, we're really excited about pomerolide because it's very potent and it's only active against one type of cancer. The specificity is very high. Can we work on it? And when the NCI says, can we work on it? We say, yes, please work on it. So they were able to make it in the laboratory because you don't want to have to go to Antarctica and harvest these animals to get the chemical. And they were successful. It took them 13 different chemical steps to get to the compound. Far too many for a drug company to be interested. Far too many. So we didn't give up. We have a microbiologist and a molecular biologist involved in the project, and we have been able to sequence the gene cluster that makes pomerolide and insert it in bacteria. And we're trying to find bacteria that will produce it so that then you can produce it in quantity and a drug company might be interested. So how cool would it be if someday we had a chemical that fought melanoma skin cancer from an Antarctic organism? And we also found in an Antarctic sponge, Dendrilla membranosa, a compound that we named darwinolide. It was the first chemical to have activity against MRSA that you don't want to get when you go to the hospital. Methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus that's under a biofilm. What's a biofilm? It's a layer of mucus and proteins. You know, you go in and have the knee replaced. And on that artificial knee, you have to develop a biofilm. And under the biofilm, you get MRSA. And then if they can't clear you, they have to take the knee implant out and do a second surgery. So this was important. So I won't belabor this, but my point is that this is just a figurative tip of the iceberg of drug discovery in Antarctica. And yet, you know, we don't want to squander it. We don't want to squander it. So when I lecture across the country about climate change, I used to get asked, is it really warming? I have not been asked that question in a very long time. I really haven't. And you can go and Google climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, and find lots of data to support that. But I want to show you what finally convinced me. These data are absolutely irrefutable. I'd like to hear you take this on. I mean, this is so the question that I get now is not, is it warming? The question is, okay, it's warming, but how do we know we have anything to do with it? Couldn't it just be a natural cycle? Earth is warming and cooled, of course. And so what I do is I share with them what convinced me as a scientist. You'll have to make up your own mind, but it's really kind of a neat story. What you're looking at here is an ice core. The ice core is laying on its side. It's about the diameter of an orange, and this ice core goes down 3,600 meters to the ice sheet of Antarctica. What is so amazing is if you pull the ice core up, you're going back through time. So at the base of the ice, in this case, at the base of the ice core, 420,000 years ago, and at the top is almost the present. Okay? So what you can do is you can analyze the amount of CO2 in the air bubbles were trapped in the ice at the time the ice was formed. And that's the red line you're looking at. That's the amount of heat trapping gas we call CO2 that was in the atmosphere. The blue line is temperature calculated indirectly. But that red line, once you look at it, I put a big bar across the top of those peaks to show you that in the past 420,000 years, the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere has never been more than 300 parts per million. Never. Look what happens over on the right when the Industrial Revolution starts. That red line just shoots up. That's when we began to burn fossil fuel. And it's gone up and up and up. And I think it's now around 425, something like that. Essentially, we've gone up about 28% in the amount of this heat trapping gas since we started burning fossil fuels. And to me, as a scientist, that's a very compelling argument. I think most scientists would agree. I can't tell you how much we're contributing to climate warming, but it's certainly significant. All right, so you wondered why those red lines go up and down in that 100,000 year cycle, and that's called the Milankovitch cycle, which has to do with the elliptical orbit of the Earth around the Sun in a 100,000 year period. All right, so Antarctica and Alabama, do they have anything in common besides starting with A? Are they worlds apart? Not necessarily so. It turns out that the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, which is primarily fueled by that huge current I talked about, the Antarctic circumpolar current that goes around Antarctica, is very much involved in driving climate, even in the northern hemisphere where we live, even in the Gulf of Mexico, in the Atlantic, the Pacific, because this current system affects atmospheric pressure, humidity, air temperature, wind patterns. They're all interconnected. So we are, even here in the Gulf of Mexico, have a connection with the changes that are coming from Antarctica. So maybe some of what we're seeing happen right now can be related to that. We just don't know. But what we're having happen, and I'm sure that some of you have been following this yourselves personally, I mean, we're having more what I call extreme heat days. Now, this really came home to me when Alabama kicked off the Ole Miss on a 3 o'clock in the afternoon game in August, something like that. And they ran out of medical gurneys to get people with heat problems out of the stadium. Now that brings it home. So we're seeing more of these heat-related extreme days. What about a timely message here? Now, I think the jury may still be out whether climate change is causing more hurricanes. But I do know that when those hurricanes get into the Gulf of Mexico and that water, as the temperature is at now, they go from a 3 to a 4. I mean, remember Hurricane Michael, 2019? Came in as a 3, turned into a 4, hit the coast, took out Mexico Beach, and then when the forensic hurricane people looked at the damage, they raised it to a 5. So I think it's very convincing now that the warmth of the Gulf water is being used to sort of generate stronger hurricanes. What about sea level rise? Well, about half of sea level rise comes from the Antarctic melt and from Greenland. And the other half is really the expansion of water molecules as water warms. So there is sunny day tidal flooding now in Miami. The water table is so high and sea levels pushing it up into the streets. On Dauphin Island, which we just love to visit, it's one of our favorite spots after this, of course. At Dauphin Island down at the West End, we have houses now. But let me just tell you, I can give you a really good deal on this house. You have to get to the stairs at low tide. But part of that is normal sand shift, but certainly sea level rise is causing that issue to be more severe. And I added this because I thought you'd be interested in knowing that Mobile Bay is uniquely vulnerable to sea level rise because of 3 things. It's in a coastline area that's naturally subsiding, sinking slowly. It has a low-lying geography, and a lot of this bay is very shallow. So that means you add a little bit of water, you have a bigger effect. And so this is an area of potential sea level impact. More intense rains. I don't know that it's raining anymore in Birmingham, Alabama, but I can tell you when it rains, it pours. And we see the Cahaba River, a beautiful 170-mile length biodiverse rich river, flooding, the banks are eroding. So these are things that are happening as we're getting heavier and heavier rains. Again, warmer air carries more water. So, gloom and doom. But that is not the message I want to leave you with, because ultimately I'm hopeful. And I want to give you an example of a wonderful thing that has happened that's very hopeful. And it has implications for what we're talking about. So, let me just go back and tell you the story. So in 1985, there were 2 technicians sitting at their desk, analyzing data, and they thought to themselves, you know, if I send this data back to our boss in England, he's not going to believe it. And they sent the data to the boss, and the boss said, you're right, I don't believe you. You're going to go back to Antarctica another year, get you a new spectrophotometer, do all the measurements again, and tell me what you find. And they did. They found the same thing. They could not believe it. They had discovered a massive hole in the atmosphere, in the ozone, that was over Antarctica. It was such a big hole that periodically extended over New Zealand. The ozone is what protects us from ultraviolet radiation, cancer. The hole in the ozone affected climate. The wind patterns below the hole were different. We had a climate impact on a global scale, and we were able to address it. How did we address it? In 1987, 2 years after the discovery and the publication in Nature of this story, 20 countries sat down around the table in Montreal, Canada, and ratified the Montreal Protocol that regulated the chlorofluorocarbons, refrigerants, that were destroying our ozone. And you know, today there are 197 signatories to the Montreal Protocol. It is probably the most successful global treaty of all time because it has worked. The hole in the ozone is stopped growing. In fact, the woman who discovered the chemistry behind the hole in the ozone told me, Susan Solomon, that now it might close by mid-century instead of end of century, a success story. And you know what? The companies that made the refrigerants, they didn't go out of business. They used innovation to come up with other chemicals that didn't destroy the atmosphere and continued on. So this is an example, I think, that's hopeful. All right, so I'm going to end by just telling you a little bit more about why this marine biologist is talking in front of you right now. Well, partly because I've been to Antarctica and I've witnessed what's happening, and I think it's important to share that story. And so when I decided I wanted to share the story, one of the first things that I was told is that you have to have a book. Nobody's going to listen to you until you have a book. And it can't be a scientific book. I mean, it's got to be a book. Right? So anyway, I discovered that to write a book, you have to have something called a literary agent. And then I discovered to have a literary agent, you have to have a book. So when you don't have those things, what you do is you turn to a friend. And how blessed have I been to be a friend of E.O. Wilson. I did not know as an assistant professor 40 years ago that when I invited him to our campus, that I would be his host for 5 days, and we would be friends ever since that moment. And he really became a mentor, and he wanted me to write. And so he was able to arrange for me to have a literary agent through his firm, Boston. And they took a chance on me, and I published my book, Lost Antarctica, and it came out, and I got a phone call from the director of Ed Wilson's Biodiversity Foundation, Paula Ehrlich. Paula said, Jim, we love the book. We like the chapter on the Adelie penguin. It's so poignant. We want to make a video, a 3 or 4 minute video. It's going to go in the zoos and the aquariums in America, and it's going to tell the story of the penguin. And she said, we love your prose. And I said, well, I thought she was asking me to narrate the video. And she said, no, we don't want you. We'll have Harrison do it. And I said, Harrison? Harrison who? Well, so Harrison Ford read from the chapter and did a very nice little thing called Ghost Rookeries, Climate Change in the Adelie Penguin on YouTube. What a great contribution. The other person that made a contribution to Lost Antarctica is this guy. Yeah. Now, can you imagine being in Antarctica at the station, and you're one of the science leaders, and the station director says to you one evening, would you host a guest tomorrow? And you say, of course. And they say, well, I can't tell you who it is. So we're in Antarctica. So, there are the security issues. So anyway, the next day, a ship pulled up, and there was Bill, and his father, Bill Sr., and his stepmother, and his son, Rory. So we spent the day showing the family around the station about the science. Bill Gates was very interested in the climate work we were doing, and renewable energy, and all these wonderful things. But the real thing that I'll always remember is when I took Bill and his father up to the room where we showed the movie about what the U.S. is doing in Antarctic science on a big screen. Put 2 chairs in the front of the room, one for Bill Jr., one for Bill Sr. They sat down. The IT guy came in and could not get Microsoft to boot up. This took a long time in computer time, so that was the Microsoft moment. Anyway, Bill was very kind to read the book and write a jacket for the board. Now, I've also been taking people to Antarctica because 15 years ago I was approached by a company called Abercrombie & Kent, and they asked if I would do a cruise that talked about climate change, had a focus on climate change, and there would actually be a philanthropic part of that. We would gift the scientists at my station a piece of equipment to do climate research. I would come along to lecture. And this has been very successful. I've enjoyed doing that cruise every year for this period of time. I think I've taken from Birmingham, where I'm from, over 200 people to Antarctica. So that's a really nice thing to show people what's happening firsthand. And of course, many of the people on this cruise are, they know their congressmen, they know their senators, they can make a difference. The other thing I've been doing is more religious focus with outreach. Because I believe that faith communities are a wonderful avenue for communicating care of creation, and that can be related, of course, to climate change and its impacts. I ran or co-directed a workshop in the mountains of Alabama, the woods of Alabama, with an Episcopal priest. We had 50 people, four or five denominations for 3 days, and it was very successful. People are interested, and they learn from that. So that, I think, is particularly here in the South, can be a very important message to push. I was involved with the Nature Conservancy at the National Office in terms of talking about climate change. Americans, we're not good about talking about climate change. So this is a program to convince you to make a pledge, to talk to one person about climate change over the next week. And then it has a wonderful source of information about how to talk about climate change. How do you find common ground? You can't be dogmatic. You can't say, go buy a Prius. What you do is you talk about when the tomatoes are ripening, or have you noticed the hurricanes have been much stronger? You want to find a place to enter the conversation without, in a good way. All right, so let me finish. Very honored several years ago, Vern and I went out to Manhattan, where I was honored by the Explorers Club for my career of work in Antarctica in education and science. But what was the true honor for me at the Explorers Club that evening was the fact that 1,600 people that were there were privy to the last living Apollo astronauts. So they sat on the stage, and we had dinner at our table with one of the three that went to the moon, Mike Collins, and then Buzz Aldrin was sitting across on the next table. It was absolutely amazing, these people. But at the end of the evening, each of the astronauts was asked to give a little anecdote that they never shared with the public over their careers. And one of them, I remember, told a story about his wedding ring floating out the door of the capsule, and one of his co-pilot grabbed it and saved the marriage. But the last gentleman, not the one that's standing here, the one with the microphone, Rusty Schreiber, who's a pilot. Rusty was the last speaker of the evening, and he got very quiet and serious, and he looked down the row of his colleagues, and he said, all of us have been up in space. We have all looked at our planet and realized it's got this very thin skin of life, this biosphere, and we really have to protect it. And that's how the evening ended, and that's how I'm going to end. Thank you.
I don't have a hand on the mic, so we will entertain maybe 10 minutes of questions max. That's so everybody can hear you.
You were talking about being in Delhi, we're sort of being that their area was being invaded by chin strap.
It is. I'm sorry.
The other,
Chin straps and the chin. Yeah.
and you said they were coming in, but is that coming in from farther out on the edges?
Yeah, they're moving. What they're doing is they're moving from the warmer areas where they're very high populations. And it's warming where we are. They're moving into that area. And the chinchillas. So what alley penguins make their nests out of little rocks. Have you seen this in the movies? They carry them. So when the Adelis disappear, the rock nest is kind of left there. And the Genties are not shy. I mean, they will move right into an Adelie nest and take it over. So many of the areas that used to have Adelies are now pretty much Genties. So they are moving down where it's getting warmer. Down the nest. That answers your question.
Sort of, but they're farther in,
They're
farther
further
inland.
inland. Now they're coastal,
They are.
pretty much coastal, yeah.
Okay.
You might be thinking of.
So you're talking about
Emperors.
latitude and not going into.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Latitude, you're absolutely right. Now, I have to tell you a fun story about rocks. Did you know there was a scientist that spent an entire field season watching penguins move those rocks? So the Adelies pick up the rocks, and then they carry it up to the female and they present it. And the female will go. Then they drop the little rock and they look very dejected and they go up and get another rock. And eventually, so it turns out this guy put numbers on the rocks that follow me. So what happens is when one penguin goes off their rock, another one comes and steals the rock and then so it's a completely zero-sum game. Rocks are moving all around the continent. Nobody's gaining numbers or size of the rock. There's got to be a moral in that story. Back.
Is there anything us as like high schoolers can do to like change the impact of climate change on our environment?
Is there anything high school students can do? Yes. Form a high school sustainability group or something like that. A team, a club. That would be wonderful. Bring in speakers like me. I go out to high schools all the time. So that kind of thing is very helpful. There's lots of things you can do, you know, as far as recycling, things like that. You know, you're not quite at the age where you're buying cars, insulating houses, or voting. But when you do, that's another important thing you can do. All right, good question. Yes.
I probably loud enough. You mentioned the kind of change in character of the questions about climate change. Originally, it was people asking, is it actually happening?
Right.
How is evidence there, or anecdotal evidence, the character of the question changed. Do you think that that's entirely driven by individual experience, or is it coincidence that that parallels the sort of institutionalized denial?
I think it depends on the individual. Some individuals are clearly feeling compelled that has to be what they say, and others, I think, you know, maybe they have. You know, I had somebody come up to me once and say, "The Earth is so big, how could we ever influence it?" I mean, there is that. You know, could we really make a change to the Earth ourselves? And yes, we can. But for them, it was like that was a no, you know, no deal. I'm not going there because we couldn't be doing this. So yeah, it depends on lots of variables how you feel about climate change. That's why it's so important we talk about it, I think. Okay, yes.
So you stated, it struck me that you stated this, one of the questions that always comes up is that, isn't it just, you know, part of nature that there will be some warming, but you said that the key is that it's happening too fast and
Right.
there's not enough time to adapt. So is that the point at which we know that we are creating like the hydrocarbons? I mean, is that the point at which we know that we are creating this by how we systemically live, what we use, how we drive?
Yes. It is, and I think it's important to realize that if we see patterns of biodiversity being depleted, as we are in many different ecosystems, species of plants that are disappearing because they're being pushed off the tops of mountains as it warms. You know, the Cahaba River where I live is a amazing place with 150 species of fish. You want to protect that biodiversity because that is part of the health of an ecosystem. So we are seeing impacts on biodiversity, and it's anticipated that there will be a lot of species lost. What's happening in terms of these climate events like hurricanes and things, you have to look at the whole picture. When you begin to see a pattern like that, I think that's when you come to grips with, maybe it is related to what we're doing. And I like to celebrate some of the things that we are doing. I mean, we are moving towards electric cars. We're insulating our homes. We're careful about what we do in terms of, travel. All these various things that we're taking into consideration, I think, are important. But yeah, it's an important time to think about it because we don't have forever. But there is change. Yes.
Yeah, I like to travel a lot and often Antarctica could be a destination, but I often just don't even want to go there because I feel like I might become part of the problem.
Yeah, I had the same feeling. She's saying that you don't want to go to Antarctica because you don't want to disturb its pristine nature. My experience was I went on the first cruise 15 years ago and sort of a dubious, I'm going to try this. And I came back convinced that it's absolutely wonderful. Because the people that come on the cruise become ambassadors to Antarctica and they talk about protecting it. They focus on doing that. They learn about climate change. They take that message back to the communities where they come from and to their elected representatives. So I think in the balance of things, it's fine to go there. At some point, is there going to be too many ships going to Antarctica? Perhaps. I mean, this has happened. You've gone to the Galapagos and you've had 3 or 4 ships parked in the same bay. You get to a point, but with Antarctica, I don't think we're there yet, thankfully. And the Antarctic cruise companies are very environmentally focused. They want to make sure they do the right thing, and they know it's important. So, yeah.
Is there an analog to this with the art? Okay, so you talk about Antarctica.
Mm-hmm.
We are now, Northwest Passage is viable.
Right.
Because it's all melting and opening up. It
Yeah.
becomes a huge heat sink. What are you guys seeing with regard to that?
Well, I don't work in the Arctic, but I can tell you that the ice is melting, and the more of the melt in the Arctic is an ocean surrounded by continents, right? Not a continent surrounded by oceans. It's fundamentally different than Antarctica. But we have in the Arctic is what's called the albedo effect, where the more ice that's melted, the more rapid the water warms, the sea is warming. So there are a lot of climate scientists that are working in the Arctic, looking at the effects of plankton on fish and salmon and these kinds of things. So there are big impacts. And then there's geopolitical impacts too, because of the opening of the Northwest Passage and potential resources there. There are not a lot of geopolitics in Antarctica. The Antarctic Treaty protects the continent from oil exploration, mineral exploration, no military. The Antarctic Treaty is wonderful. It's sort of taken Antarctica and made it a place for global peace and science. It's a collaborative place to do science. There's a couple countries that are pretty adamant that they own the Antarctic Peninsula. Chile and Argentina. And if you go to their maps, you'll see in the corner of the country's map, they've got a little insert showing that they own the Antarctic Peninsula. Both of them. I always got a kick out of the fact that I came to an Antarctic Argentinian station once, and there were 30 second graders living at the station with their parents for a year. I said, "What's going on?" "Well, we have school." "Why do you have school?" "Well, to make a long story short, if you want to claim land, you have a community upon it. How do you prove you have a community? You have school." So here they were, and at the end of the year, they were replaced by another 30 second graders. The other thing is they used to have a program where young Argentinians were flown into Antarctica to give birth. Because one of the ways you claim land is to give birth upon it. Thankfully, that program no longer exists.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Well, we have books over on the table there. If you
Yep.
would like to get one,